October 2014. Jarryd Hayne had just conquered rugby league. At just 26 years old, he was a two-time Dally M medalist, a State of Origin superstar, and one of the most recognisable athletes in Australia. He had money, he had fame, he had the admiration of millions. Sign a long-term contract, build a legacy, become a one-club legend. But Jarryd Hayne wasn't like most players. Instead of enjoying the success he had spent years building, Hayne made a decision that stunned the sporting world. He walked away from the NRL, away from Parramatta, away from the game that made him a superstar, all to chase a dream that most experts believed was impossible. A dream that would take him halfway across the world and ultimately change the course of his life forever. Because the story of Jarryd Hayne isn't just the story of a rugby league player. It's the story of ambition, of risk, fame, and expectation. And one of the most dramatic journeys Australian sport has ever seen. This is the rise and fall of Jarryd Hayne. Long before the packed stadiums, long before the Dally M medals, long before the NFL, there was a kid growing up in Sydney. Jarryd Lee Hayne was born February 15th, 1988. Sport was in his blood from the very beginning. His father, Manoa Thompson, had played professional rugby league, becoming one of the first Fijian players to reach the highest level of the game. Rugby league wasn't just something Hayne watched. It was part of his identity, part of his family, part of the culture that surrounded him growing up. But while many children dream of becoming professional athletes, very few show signs of greatness at an early age. Jarryd Hayne was different. From the moment he stepped on the football field, coaches noticed something special. He was bigger, faster, stronger, and perhaps mostly important, he seemed to see the game differently from everyone else. While other kids relied on structure, Hayne relied on instinct. He could create opportunities out of nothing, turn a routine play into a highlight, and make difficult things look effortless. It wasn't long before people started talking, not about whether he would play first grade rugby league, but about how far he could go. As a teenager, Hayne attended Matraville Sports High School, a school known for producing elite athletes. It was there that his reputation continued to grow. Week after week, he dominated junior competitions. Opponents struggled to contain him. Selectors couldn't ignore him. And by the time he reached his late teenage years, one thing was becoming clear. Jarryd Hayne wasn't just another promising prospect. He was a future superstar. In 2006, at just 18 years old, Jarryd Hayne made his NRL debut for the Parramatta Eels. The expectations were already enormous, but what happened next exceeded almost everyone's predictions. Most young players need years to establish themselves. Hayne needed months. From the moment he arrived, he looked like he belonged. His combination of speed, power, balance, and natural football ability immediately stood out. Defenders struggled to bring him down. Fans couldn't take their eyes off him, and commentators began running out of ways to describe what they were seeing. By the end of his debut season, Hayne had scored 17 tries in just 16 games. It was an incredible return for a teenager. More importantly, it had confirmed what many had already suspected. The NRL had found its next superstar. As a reward for his outstanding debut season, Hayne was named Dally M Rookie of the Year. It was the first major individual honour of his career, but it wouldn't be the last. Not even close. The scary part wasn't what Hayne had already achieved. It was how much room he still had to improve. At just 18 years old, he was already one of the most exciting players in the rugby league, and every season he had seemed to get better. In rugby league, there are great players, then there are State of Origin players. For decades, State of Origin has represented the highest level of rugby league in Australia. The best players, the biggest stage, the greatest pressure. And in 2007, just 1 year after making his NRL debut, Jarryd Hayne earned his chance. For many players, Origin can be overwhelming. The intensity is different, the physicality is different, the expectations are different. But Hayne looked completely at home. He wasn't intimidated by the occasion. If anything, he seemed to thrive under the spotlight. Every time the stage got bigger, Hayne got better. It quickly became clear that he wasn't just a future representative player. He was going to become one of the faces of the game. Over the following years, his performance for New South Wales would help elevate him from rugby league star to national sporting icon. But while Hayne was earning his representative honours, his club career was about to enter another level entirely. And it would all accumulate in one of the greatest individual seasons rugby league has ever seen. By 2009, Jarryd Hayne was already one of the NRL's best players, but even his biggest supporters couldn't have predicted what was about to happen. The Parramatta Eels had entered the season with modest expectations. For much of the year, they looked like destined to miss the finals altogether. The season was drifting, their premiership hopes were fading. Then something changed, and that something was Jarryd Hayne. Over the final months of the season, Hayne produced a stretch of football that many fans still regard as the greatest individual run of form in NRL history. Week after week, he took over games, scoring tries, creating opportunities, breaking tackles, producing moments that seemed impossible. Every time Parramatta needed something special, Hayne delivered. Fans started referring to him as the Hayne Plane, and everywhere he went, the hype continued to grow. What made his run so remarkable wasn't simply the highlights, it was the consistency. Every week he looked like the best player on the field, no matter the opposition, no matter the pressure, no matter the stakes. As Parramatta surged towards the finals, Hayne became the story of the season. Not the Eels, not the premiership race, Jarryd Hayne. The competition belonged to him, and with every brilliant performance, comparisons to the greatest players in rugby league history became louder. By the time the regular season had ended, there was a little doubt about who the best player in the game was. The only question remained was whether Hayne could complete the fairy tale, because Parramatta had somehow transformed from premiership outsiders into genuine contenders, and they were being carried by one man, Jarryd Hayne. As the finals arrived, the pressure increased. Every mistake mattered. Every game could end a season. Yet somehow, Hayne continued producing magic. The deeper Parramatta went into September, the more belief grew. Could one player really carry an entire team to a premiership? It felt impossible, but Hayne was making people believe. Every match seemed to feature another unforgettable moment, another incredible run, another match-winning play. And while Parramatta ultimately fell short in the grand final, the season had already changed Hayne's career forever. The awards followed soon after: the Dally M Medal, the game's highest individual honour, recognition as the best player in rugby league. For many players, winning one Dally M Medal would define a career. For Jarryd Hayne, it felt like the beginning of something even bigger. At just 21 years old, he wasn't simply one of the NRL's biggest stars. He was becoming one of Australia's biggest athletes, the face of a generation, a player many believed could become one of the greatest rugby league players of all time. And remarkably, his story was only just getting started, because the years ahead would bring even greater success, greater fame, and eventually a decision so shocking that would leave the entire sporting world speechless. By the end of 2009, Jarryd Hayne wasn't just a rugby league player. He was a phenomenon. Everywhere he went, people wanted a piece of him. Kids wanted to be him. Sponsors wanted to work with him. And rugby league fans couldn't stop talking about him. The nickname the Hayne Plane had become part of the Australian sporting culture. For a brief period, it felt like Hayne was untouchable. The scary part? He was only 21 years old. Most athletes don't reach their peak until their mid to late 20s. Hayne was already being compared to some of the greatest players the game had ever seen. The expectation wasn't that he would become a superstar. That had already happened. The expectation was that he would become an all-time great. But with greatness comes pressure. And in Australia, there are a few stages bigger than the state of origin. For years, New South Wales had struggled against Queensland. The Maroons were building what many would eventually consider the greatest dynasty in rugby league history, led by players like Cameron Smith, Jonathan Thurston, Billy Slater, and Cooper Cronk. Queensland seemed unstoppable. For New South Wales fans, it was torture. Year after year, they watched their rivals celebrate. Year after year, they searched for someone who could turn the tide. Many believed Jarryd Hayne could be the player. When he pulled on the sky blue jersey, expectations followed him everywhere. Hayne rarely seemed bothered by the pressure. If anything, the bigger the game, the better he became. Throughout the early 2010s, Hayne produced countless origin moments, powerful runs, clutch plays, individual brilliance, the type of moments that became part of rugby league folklore. Even when New South Wales struggled collectively, Hayne often stood out. He became one of the few players capable of producing something extraordinary when his team needed it most. And while Origin victories remained difficult to come by, Hayne's reputation continued to grow. He wasn't just one of the best players in the NRL, he was one of the best players in the world. By 2011 and 2012, something interesting began happening. The conversation around Jarryd Hayne started changing. Earlier in his career, fans had celebrated every achievement. Now they expected them. Every game was judged against impossible standards. Every performance was compared to his incredible 2009 season. And that created a problem, because when someone sets the bar high, even greatness can start to look ordinary. Hayne was still producing brilliant football, still representing New South Wales, still playing at an elite level. But many people weren't comparing him to the other players anymore. They were comparing him to himself, and that's a comparison almost nobody can win. The pressure continued to build. The expectations continued to grow. Yet despite everything, Hayne remained one of rugby league's biggest stars. Then came 2014, a year that would change everything. For many athletes, winning one Dally M medal is the defining achievement of a career. Very few ever win two. In 2014, Jarryd Hayne reminded everyone exactly how good he was. Throughout the season, he delivered one dominant performance after another. An explosive running game was still there. The speed was still there. The ability to create something out of nothing was still there. And once again, Hayne found himself standing above the rest of the competition. When the Dally M votes were counted, the results were clear. Jarryd Hayne had won his second Dally M medal. 5 years after his incredible 2009 season, he was once again recognised as the best player in the rugby league. At 26 years old, he had everything. A superstar career, financial security, a loyal fan base, and the chance to spend the next decade building an even greater legacy. Most players would have signed a long-term deal. Most players would have stayed exactly where they were. Most players would have protected everything they had built. Jarryd Hayne had other plans. October 2014. Rumours began circulating. At first, few people believed them. The stories sounded ridiculous. Why would the best player in the rugby league walk away from the game? Why would someone leave behind millions of dollars? Why would anyone risk everything they had spent years building? Then the rumours became reality. Jarryd Hayne announced he was leaving the NRL, not to join another club, not to take a bigger contract, not to retire. He was leaving Australia entirely. His goal? The National Football League, the NFL, one of the most competitive sporting leagues on the planet. The reaction was immediate. Fans were stunned. Commentators questioned the decisions. Experts called it unrealistic. Some even called it crazy. After all, Hayne wasn't switching clubs. He was switching sports. Completely. The skills that made him a rugby league superstar didn't automatically translate to American football. Different rules, different tactics, different techniques, different everything. And unlike most NFL hopefuls, Hayne wasn't starting at 18. He was starting at 26, an age where most professional athletes are already entering their prime. The odds were stacked against him. But Hayne didn't seem interested in the odds. He believed he could do it, and that belief was enough. For years, Jarryd Hayne had been one of Australia's biggest sporting stars. Now he was starting over. No special treatment, no guaranteed contracts, no superstar status. In America, no one cared about Dally M medals. Nobody cared about the state of origin. Nobody cared about the Hayne plane. To NFL teams, he was simply just another athlete trying to make the roster. For the first time in years, Hayne was an outsider, and the adjustment wasn't easy. He moved to the United States, learned an entirely new sport, adapted to new training methods, studied complex playbooks, and spent countless hours trying to master skills that American players had spent their entire lives learning. It was a humbling experience, but it was also fascinating. For the first time in his career, Hayne wasn't the superstar. He was the underdog, and people love underdogs. Back in Australia, the media followed every step of his journey. Every training session, every trial, every rumour. Millions wanted to know whether the impossible could actually happen. Could an Australian rugby league player really make it in the NFL? Most experts still doubted it, but Jarryd Hayne had spent his entire life proving people wrong, and soon he had received the opportunity that he had been chasing, an opportunity that would place him one step closer to achieving the impossible. March 2015. After months of uncertainty, Hayne signed with the San Francisco 49ers. It was a historic moment, not just for him, but for Australian sport. Suddenly, the dream felt real. The challenge wasn't over, far from it. Signing was one thing, making the final roster was another. NFL teams regularly cut out dozens of players before the season begins. Most observers expected Hayne's journey to end during the preseason. The competition was simply too strong. The learning curve was too steep, and the odds were too overwhelming. But once again, Hayne surprised everyone. Training camp became preseason. Preseason became roster cuts. And somehow, Jarryd Hayne kept surviving. Every week brought another challenge. Every week brought another opportunity. And every week, he moved closer to history. Back home, Australians watched nervously. Could he actually do it? Could a rugby league superstar become an NFL player? After everything he had risked, everything came down to one final decision. The decision that would determine whether the gamble was worth it. And when that moment arrived, Jarryd Hayne achieved what many believed was impossible. He made the team. For the first time, the dream was no longer a dream. It was reality. And Jarryd Hayne became one of the most talked about athletes in Australia all over again. But as incredible as the story has been so far, the next chapter would prove even more challenging. Because making the NFL was one thing. Staying there was something else entirely. September 2015. After months of uncertainty, sacrifice, and relentless work, Jarryd Hayne had done what almost nobody thought was possible. He had made the San Francisco 49ers final roster. For an Australian athlete with no American football background, it was an extraordinary achievement. Back home, the news dominated headlines. Sports bulletins led with updates from America. Fans woke up early to watch NFL games. Even people who had never watched American football suddenly cared about the San Francisco 49ers. Because one of Australia's biggest sporting stars was now competing on one of the world's biggest stages. And for a brief moment, it looked like the gamble had paid off. Hayne's early preseason performance had already captured attention. His powerful running style seemed perfectly suited for an open field nature of kick returns. Every time he touched the ball, there was excitement. There was unpredictability. There was the feeling that something special might happen. The same feeling rugby league fans had experienced for years. For the first time, it appeared that Jarryd Hayne's impossible dream might actually become reality. But making an NFL roster was only the beginning. Staying there was far more difficult. American football is one of the most demanding professional sports in the world. Every position requires extreme precision. Every mistake is magnified. Every player is fighting to keep their place. And unlike rugby league, where Hayne had spent years mastering his craft, he was now competing against athletes who had been playing football their entire lives. The learning curve was enormous. Every game brought new challenges. Every training season brought new expectations. Hayne's athletic ability was never questioned. His speed was there. His power was there. His natural talent was obvious. But American football isn't simply about athleticism. It's about timing, technique, decision-making, and understanding an incredibly complex game. As the season progressed, Hayne found himself battling for opportunities. At times he looked capable of becoming a genuine NFL contributor. At other times, the limitations of his experience became apparent. The dream was still alive, but it was becoming clear that the road ahead would be much harder than many Australians had imagined. And eventually, reality began to catch up. By 2016, Hayne faced another crossroads. The NFL dream had not unfolded the way that many had hoped. He had achieved something remarkable by making the league, but becoming a long-term NFL player was proving far more difficult. Then came another shock. Jarryd Hayne decided to walk away. For the second time in less than 2 years, he left behind a professional sporting career to chase another dream. This time, the Olympics. Specifically, rugby sevens, representing Fiji. The decision stunned people once again. Many wondered whether he was giving up too quickly. Others admired his willingness to take risks. But regardless of opinion, one thing had become clear. Jarryd Hayne wasn't motivated by comfort. He wasn't interested in taking the safe option. He was constantly searching for the next challenge, the next mountain to climb, the next impossible dream. Unfortunately, not every dream ends the way you imagine. For Hayne, representing Fiji at the Olympic Games carried deep personal meaning. His family heritage connected him strongly to Fiji. The opportunity to represent the nation on the world's biggest sporting stage was something he genuinely valued. But once again, time was against him. Olympic rugby sevens is a completely different game. Different pace, different tactics, different physical demands. And unlike many of his competitors, Hayne was arriving late. While others had spent years preparing for Rio, Hayne was trying to fast-track the process. The challenge was enormous, and despite his obvious talent, the Olympic dream never fully materialised. The fairy tale ending that he had hoped for remained out of reach. For the first time in years, it had seemed like every major gamble was ending in disappointment. The NFL, the Olympics, neither had delivered an outcome many had imagined. Eventually, there was only one place left to go: home. When Jarryd Hayne returned to the Parramatta Eels, the reaction was massive. Fans were excited. Media coverage exploded. The expectations immediately returned. After all, this wasn't just any player. This was Jarryd Hayne, the man who carried Parramatta Eels to a grand final, the man who had won 2 Dally M medals, the man who had chased the NFL, the man who had become one of Australia's most famous athletes. Supporters hoped they would once again see the player who had dominated the NRL, the player who had once looked unstoppable. But sport can be cruel. Sometimes the second chapter never quite matches the first. Hayne still produced moments of brilliance. There were flashes of the old magic, moments that reminded fans why they had fallen in love with him in the first place. But something felt different. The aura that had once surrounded him wasn't quite the same. The game had moved on. The competition had changed. And perhaps most importantly, expectations remained impossibly high. Every performance was compared to his peak. Every game was measured against 2009, and that's a standard almost nobody could consistently meet. Something else had changed too: the public's relationship with Jarryd Hayne. Early in his career, he had been viewed almost entirely through the lens of football. Every conversation focused on what he could do on the field. Now the conversation was becoming more complicated. Focus wasn't always football anymore. Media attention followed him everywhere. Every decision attracted scrutiny. Every headline generated debate. For the first time, it had felt like the story was starting to move beyond sport. And once that happens, things can change very quickly. Because while Hayne's football achievements remained extraordinary, the next chapter of his life would become dominated by something else entirely. A chapter that would overshadow almost everything that came before it. A chapter that would fundamentally alter how many people viewed his legacy. And a chapter that would transform one of Australia's most celebrated athletes into one of the most controversial sporting figures. The rise has been remarkable, the journey has been extraordinary, but the fall was about to begin. For more than a decade, Jarryd Hayne had been one of Australia's biggest sporting stars. His career had been filled with moments most athletes could only dream of: Dally M medals, State of Origin success, international recognition, the NFL, the Olympic dream. Whether people loved him or hated him, there was no denying one thing: Jarryd Hayne had lived one of the most extraordinary careers in Australian sport. But in September 2018, everything changed. What followed would become one of the longest and most public legal sagas involving a major Australian athlete. And for years, it would dominate discussions about Jarryd Hayne for more than anything that he achieved on a football field. In late 2018, allegations emerged relating to an encounter that occurred on the night of the NRL Grand Final.
In more breaking news this afternoon, Jarryd Hayne has been sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison over the rape of a woman inside a Newcastle home in 2018.
Actually proceed through the legal system, and almost immediately public attention intensified. News outlets covered every development. Sports programs discussed the case. social media exploded with opinions. For many people, the football career that had once defined Hayne was suddenly no longer the focus. The legal proceedings became the story. And unlike a football match, there was no quick result, no final siren, no immediate conclusion. Instead, the process would continue for years. One of the reasons Hayne's story became so significant was the sheer length of the legal process. The case went through multiple trials, appeals, court decisions, and ongoing public scrutiny. Every new development generated headlines. Every court appearance became national news. For supporters, critics, and neutral observers alike, it seemed impossible to escape. What made the situation even more complicated was that the legal process itself continued to evolve. Different outcomes emerged at different stages. Court decisions were challenged, appeals were lodged, new rulings were handed down. The story became increasingly complex, and throughout it all, public opinion remained deeply divided. Some people focused on the legal proceedings. Others focused on Hayne's football achievements. Many struggled to separate the athlete from the ongoing court battles. As the years passed, the discussion around Jarryd Hayne changed completely. He was no longer primarily being discussed as a rugby league player. He had become one of the most controversial figures in Australian sport. For athletes, reputation can take decades to build, and sometimes only a short period to lose. Throughout the early stages of his career, Hayne had been viewed as one of Australia's golden boys, a once-in-a-generation talent, a player who could do things nobody else could, the player who carried Parramatta, the one who dared to chase the NFL. But now, the conversation was different. The highlights were no longer leading sports bulletins. Football achievements were no longer dominating headlines. Instead, discussion focused on courtrooms, appeals, legal outcomes, and uncertainty. For many fans, it was difficult to reconcile the two versions of Jarryd Hayne, the athlete they had grown up watching, and the man now dominating headlines for entirely different reasons. The contrast was striking, and perhaps that's why the story captured so much public attention. Because very few Australian athletes had experienced such extraordinary highs, and very few experienced such dramatic falls. As the legal process continued, multiple court decisions shaped the story. The proceedings stretched across years. What many expected to be resolved quickly became a saga that seemed endless. Then a major development occurred. The most recent conviction was overturned on appeal.
Former NRL star Jarryd Hayne has had his sexual assault convictions quashed on appeal and is set to face a third trial.
Prosecutors later decided not to pursue a fourth trial. For the first time in years, the legal process had effectively come to an end. But while the court proceedings may have concluded, the debate surrounding Jarryd Hayne had certainly not. Because legal outcomes don't automatically resolve public opinion, and they don't erase history. Instead, they often leave behind difficult questions. Questions that people continue debating long after the headlines disappeared. This is where Jarryd Hayne's story becomes complicated. Because unlike many athletes, his legacy can't be explained with a simple answer. If you look purely at football, the achievements are extraordinary. 2 Dally M medals, state of origin success, international recognition, one of the greatest individual seasons rugby league has ever seen. A player many believed possessed talent rarely seen in an Australian sport. Then there was the NFL journey. An Australian athlete walking away from superstardom to chase a dream on the other side of the world, making an NFL roster, competing at the highest level of American football, achieving something most experts considered impossible. Those achievements alone would be enough to define most careers. Yet the later chapters of Hayne's life ensured the conversation would never be that simple. Because when people discuss Jarryd Hayne today, they rarely discuss only football. They discuss everything. The triumphs, the risks, the controversies, the legal battles, the what-ifs. And perhaps that's what makes his story so fascinating. Not because it fits neatly into one category, but because it doesn't. Every generation of sport has a few athletes who leave people asking questions. Not about what they achieved, but about what they could have achieved. What if Hayne stayed in the NRL? What if he had never left for America? What if the NFL experiment had exceeded beyond anyone's expectations? What if he had spent another decade dominating rugby league? What if the records could have been broken? What legacy could have been built? We'll never know, because Jarryd Hayne never followed the safe path. He never chose comfort. He never settled for what he had already achieved. Instead, he chased bigger dreams, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but always fearlessly. And whether people admire that or criticise it, it's impossible to deny that it made his story unique. Jarryd Hayne's journey is one of the most remarkable stories Australian sport has ever produced. A gifted teenager from Western Sydney, a rugby league superstar, a Dally M medalist, a state of origin hero, an athlete who walked away from everything to chase the NFL, and a man whose later years became defined by controversy and legal battles. His story contains extraordinary heights, painful lows, and enough twists to fill multiple careers. For some people, Jarryd Hayne will always be remembered as one of the most naturally talented rugby league players ever seen. For others, the later chapters of his life will forever shape how they view his legacy. But regardless of opinion, one fact remains undeniable. Very few athletes have experienced a journey quite like Jarryd Hayne, and very few stories in Australian sport are as compelling. Because sometimes the greatest stories aren't the ones with perfect endings. They are the ones leaving us asking questions long after they're over. And decades from now, people will be asking the same question. How should we remember Jarryd Hayne? That answer is entirely up to you.